What you are about to see is not a report on a war, a natural disaster, or a financial crash. It is the story of a seismic, quiet revolution in global power. A revolution signed not with guns, but with pens, and orchestrated not from Washington, but from Ottawa and Brussels. Tonight, we present a special documentary investigation: The Brussels Gambit: How Canada Outmaneuvered American Dominance in the New Cold War. The early 21st century witnessed a geopolitical tectonic shift, one not marked by the thunder of artillery or the silent dread of nuclear tests, but by the quiet signing of documents in sterile conference rooms in Brussels. While the world's media was fixated on the bombastic pronouncements and inflammatory tweets emanating from Washington, D.C., a strategic realignment of historic proportions was being finalized, one that would fundamentally alter the balance of military industrial power in the West. The year was 2025. Donald Trump, having secured an unprecedented and contentious second term, was engaged in what he termed the art of the deal on a global scale, a practice characterized by public threats, punitive tariffs, and the transactional treatment of alliances that had stood for generations. His primary target on a chilly December day seemed to be Canada, America's neighbor, largest trading partner, and NATO ally, whom he threatened with crippling 35% tariffs and publicly mused about annexing as the 51st state. Yet, as those threats flashed across news feeds and cable networks, a different story was reaching its climax across the Atlantic, a story of quiet diplomacy, strategic foresight, and a stunning humiliation for American hegemony. On December 1st, 2025, Canada, under the leadership of a newly minted prime minister, secured full membership in the European Union's cornerstone defense initiative, the Security Action for Europe (SAFE) Fund, a $244 billion fortress of financing from which the United States and indeed all other non-EU nations were explicitly barred. This is the story of how that happened, why it matters far beyond defense contracts, and what it reveals about the catastrophic cost of mistaking allies for adversaries. To understand the magnitude of Canada's maneuver, one must first appreciate the relentless pressure applied by the Trump administration in the years leading up to it. The relationship between the United States and Canada, often described as the world's longest undefended border and closest friendship, had deteriorated into something resembling a hostile corporate takeover. Trump's worldview, articulated through speeches, tweets, and policy directives, rejected multilateralism and mutual security in favor of a stark zero-sum nationalism. Allies were not partners, they were competitors who had been taking advantage of American generosity for decades. This philosophy manifested in a series of economic body blows. It began with the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, rebranded as the USMCA, which was secured under the duress of steel and aluminum tariffs. Canada, a nation whose economy is deeply integrated with the US, felt these measures acutely. The 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and 10% on aluminum, imposed under the dubious pretext of national security, were a profound shock. For Canada, it was an act of betrayal, a national security designation applied to a country that had stood shoulder to shoulder with the US in every major conflict since World War I, including in Afghanistan, where Canadian soldiers died alongside Americans. The rhetoric escalated alongside the tariffs. Trump publicly humiliated Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the 2018 G7 summit in Charlevoix, Quebec, calling him very dishonest and weak after Trudeau reiterated Canada's intent to retaliate against U.S. tariffs. This was not private diplomatic friction. It was a deliberate, public degradation of a close ally on the world stage. The message to Ottawa and to the world was clear. American partnership was conditional, volatile, and subject to the whims of a president who viewed loyalty as a one-way street. The situation reached a new precipice in July 2025. Following Canada's vote at the United Nations in support of a resolution affirming Palestinian statehood, a position consistent with decades of Canadian and international diplomacy, Trump's response was swift and vicious. He accused Canada of backing terrorism and stabbing America in the back, announcing on Truth Social that he was considering raising tariffs on all Canadian goods to 35%. For an economy where 75% of exports go south of the border, this was not a negotiating tactic. It was an existential threat. Trump framed it as punishment for disloyalty, a lesson in the consequences of independent foreign policy. While this drama played out in the open, a parallel narrative was unfolding with deliberate secrecy in the capitals of Europe. The European Union, a bloc of 27 nations with a combined GDP rivaling that of the United States, had been conducting a sobering strategic audit since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The war on its doorstep exposed severe deficiencies in European defense capabilities, from ammunition stocks to air defense systems to the industrial capacity to produce them. For decades, Europe had comfortably underinvested in its own military, secure in the assumption that the American security umbrella, institutionalized through NATO, was permanent and inviolable. The Trump presidency, first from 2017-2021 and then renewed in 2025, shattered that assumption. His repeated questioning of NATO's Article 5 collective defense guarantee, his demands for immediate payment from allies, and his overt admiration for authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin created a profound crisis of confidence in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris. Europe realized that its primary guarantor of security could not be relied upon. The unthinkable, American abandonment, now had to be planned for. The result was Security Action for Europe, SAFE, conceived not as a complement to NATO, but as an insurance policy against its potential failure. SAFE was a financial mechanism of staggering scale, 150 billion euros, approximately $244 billion CAD, in low-interest loans, backed by the EU's AOIA credit rating, specifically earmarked to turbocharge the European defense industrial base. This was not mere stimulus. It was the financial engine for a continent-wide rearmament. The funds were designated for concrete projects: next-generation battle tanks, sovereign drone fleets, integrated air and missile defense networks, cyber warfare suites, and space-based surveillance capabilities. The goal was explicit: to achieve strategic autonomy in defense by 2030, reducing Europe's dependency on American technology, spare parts, and political goodwill. Crucially, SAFE was designed as a closed shop. The legislation establishing the fund specified that participation, including access to its financing and the right to bid on projects it enabled, was restricted to member states of the European Union and associated partners under very specific, pre-existing frameworks. This was a deliberate choice. It was a buy-European act on a continental scale, meant to ensure that the billions spent would rebuild European industry, not simply line the pockets of American defense contractors. The United Kingdom, post-Brexit, pleaded for associate status and was flatly rejected. Australia, a steadfast partner in the Pacific, lobbied intensely but could not even secure a place at the negotiating table. The United States, the architect of the post-war security order, found itself on the outside looking in at the very alliance system it had created. The fortress was built and the drawbridge was up. The Canadian political landscape in early 2025 was one of turmoil and transition. Justin Trudeau's Liberal government, having led the country for nearly a decade, was languishing in the polls, 26 points behind the Conservative opposition. Wearied by constant battles with Washington and facing an electorate concerned about economic stagnation and the rising cost of living, Trudeau announced in January that he would resign as party leader and prime minister. The Liberal Party seemed headed for a historic defeat, a collapse that would cede power to a Conservative Party whose own relationship with Trump-style politics was ambiguous. Into this vacuum stepped a figure unlike any typical Canadian politician, Mark Carney. A man who had never held elected office, Carney's credibility was forged in the rarefied world of central banking. As governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, he guided the country through the worst of the global financial crisis with a steady hand, earning international acclaim. His subsequent appointment as governor of the Bank of England, the first non-Briton to hold the post in the institution's 300-year history, cemented his reputation as one of the world's most trusted and capable financial statesmen. He was a technocrat of global stature, fluent in the language of high finance, international regulation, and crisis management. Carney entered the Liberal leadership race not as a career politician making promises, but as a national emergency manager delivering a diagnosis. His platform was singular and stark. Canada's existential vulnerability was its economic and security overdependence on a single, unpredictable partner. He framed the constant tariff threats and public humiliations from Washington not as a temporary diplomatic spat, but as a structural weakness that threatened Canadian sovereignty and prosperity. "We have mortgaged our national security to a bank that can change the terms of the loan on a whim," he stated in his first major speech. "It is not strength to have only one customer for our resources and one supplier for our defense. It is strategic fragility." His message resonated with a business community terrified of Trump's next tweet and a populace weary of being America's punching bag. In March 2025, Carney won the Liberal leadership with a staggering 85.9% of the vote, a mandate for profound change. He immediately ascended to the prime ministership, inheriting a minority parliament but wielding immense moral and political authority. His foreign policy directive was clear: accelerate the diversification of Canada's economic and security relationships with all deliberate speed. Europe, which shared Canada's democratic values, its multilateral instincts, and its newfound alarm about American reliability, was the obvious candidate. Carney's background was his superpower in this endeavor. In the boardrooms of Frankfurt and the finance ministries of Brussels, he was not seen as just another politician. He was the Carney, a peer who understood bond yields, credit default swaps, and the intricate workings of the European stability mechanism. This allowed him to bypass much of the traditional diplomatic posturing. When he arrived in Brussels in June 2025, just 3 months into his premiership, he spoke not in the language of vague alliances, but of concrete, mutually beneficial financial and industrial integration. The summit resulted in the Canada-EU Strategic Security and Defense Partnership. To most outside observers, and indeed to a distracted Washington, it appeared to be a routine diplomatic accord, a series of memoranda on information sharing, joint exercises, and defense research. Editorials dismissed it as photo-op diplomacy. This was exactly what Carney and his European counterparts intended. Buried in the technical annexes of the partnership, however, was the critical legal and diplomatic foundation, a clause establishing Canada as a strategic industrial partner of the EU, a newly created category that provided the necessary predicate for a formal application to the SAFE Fund. The negotiations for this clause were conducted in utter secrecy. A small, trusted cell within Global Affairs Canada, working directly with Carney's Chief of Staff and officials from the European Commission's Directorate General for Defense Industry and Space, DFS, hammered out the details. They leveraged a powerful argument. Canada represented a unique opportunity for Europe. Here was a G7 nation, a fellow NATO member with a top 5 military budget within the alliance, possessing advanced technological sectors in aerospace, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. Crucially, it was a North American nation with industrial standards and security clearances interoperable with the US system, meaning it could produce components that would seamlessly integrate into European platforms, yet it was not the United States. As one leaked European Commission assessment put it, Canada offers capability without coercion, partnership without predation. While Trump was publicly berating weak allies and threatening trade war, Carney was in Brussels building a bridge, and by December 1, 2025, that bridge was complete. Canada's application for full participation in the SAFE Fund was approved. The leaked Pentagon memos dated December 3rd reveal the depth of the American shock. One senior defense official scrawled in the margin, "How did we not see this? Who was asleep at the wheel?" The answer was that Washington was too busy turning the wheel against its allies to notice they were building a new vehicle. Canada's admission into SAFE was not merely a symbolic diplomatic victory, it was the keys to a vast financial and industrial kingdom. The benefits, structured through painstaking negotiation, were designed to transfer decades of defense industrial activity from the United States to a new transatlantic axis between Canada and Europe. First, preferential access to the fortress market. Overnight, Canadian companies, from giants like Bombardier, Aerospace, and CAE, training simulators, to niche specialists in quantum sensing and composite materials, gained the right to compete for contracts across the 27 EU member states funded by SAFE's $150 billion Euro war chest. This was not opportunity, it was integration. Canadian firms could now bid to supply the Polish Hussar tank program, the Franco-German Future Combat Air System, FCAS, the Italian-led Eurodrone project, and the pan-European Iron Dome-style air defense initiative. They were no longer external vendors, but insiders in the most significant rearmament program since the Reagan buildup. American contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and General Dynamics, historically dominant in these very sectors, found themselves categorically excluded. The Buy American Act had finally met its Buy European counterpart, and Canada had secured a golden visa. Second, the Carney exemptions, rewriting the rules. The standard SAFE regulations contained formidable rules of origin designed to protect the European industrial base. For any major defense project, a minimum of 65% of the value had to be generated within the EU. This was a non-negotiable barrier meant to prevent the fund from simply subsidizing American imports. Canada's negotiators, however, achieved what was considered impossible, a suite of special exemptions for Canadian industry. In key, high-demand technological areas identified as European weaknesses, Canadian companies could contribute up to 80% of a system's total value. The categories were surgical and devastating to U.S. interests. Unmanned aerial and counter-drone systems, an area where American firms like General Atomics, Predator Reaper drones, had a global monopoly. These exemptions meant that for a European country wanting to build a new drone fleet, partnering with a Canadian company like Teledyne DALSA or MDA, famous for the Canadarm, was not just allowed, but incentivized, as it allowed for greater non-EU content than with any other partner. Canada had effectively been granted a status more privileged than even some EU members, becoming Europe's chosen vessel for bypassing American technological lock-in. Third, the golden financing. Perhaps the most potent advantage was financial. Canadian defense firms and the Canadian government procuring European gear gained access to the EU's low-interest lending facility. The mechanism is powerful. The European Union, with its pristine 8AA credit rating, borrows money on international capital markets at rates far lower than any single nation, including Canada, could achieve alone. It then lends these funds to participating governments and, through them, to certified companies essentially at cost, with only a minor administrative fee. For a Canadian manufacturer looking to build a new artillery shell factory or a quantum computing lab for cyber defense, this meant access to capital with interest rates 2 to 3 percentage points below commercial loans. This wasn't just cheaper money, it was a long-term competitive moat. It allowed for 20 and 30-year investment horizons, enabling the build-out of industrial capacity that would take decades to mature. The economic activity, jobs, and intellectual property generated by this investment, all of which had, for 2 generations, flowed almost exclusively to the United States, would now be anchored in Canada and Europe. Fourth, building a permanent war machine. Recognizing this was a generational shift, the Carney government did not create a temporary office or task force. It established the Canadian Defence Industrial Participation Agency, CDIPA, a permanent, well-funded statutory body with a mandate stretching to 2070. CDIPA's role was to be the matchmaker, facilitator, and troubleshooter between Canadian industry and the 27 different European defense procurement bureaucracies. It began work immediately, creating a classified database cross-referencing Canadian technological competencies with the projected needs outlined in the EU's Capability Development Plan. Its teams included former procurement officers, engineers, trade lawyers, and diplomats. Their goal, as stated in an internal memo, was to facilitate and secure a minimum of $15 billion in annual defense contract flow from Europe to Canada by 2030. This was institutionalization of the divorce from the U.S. defense ecosystem and the marriage to the European one. The implications of the Canada-EU safe deal extend far beyond balance sheets and factory floors. It represents a fundamental rupture in the psychology of the Western alliance, a shift in the very currency of international relations, from raw power to reliability. For the 75 years following World War II, the transatlantic bond was underpinned by a simple, brutal calculus. American military power was supreme, and American security guarantees were credible. This allowed Europe to focus on economic integration and social development, a luxury paid for by American strategic dominance. Canada, nestled under this same umbrella, followed a similar path, often criticized in Washington as a free rider for its consistent failure to meet NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target, hovering around 1.3%. The criticism had merit but missed the point. The system was designed for dependency. The U.S. provided security, and in return, it expected allegiance and, crucially, a captive market for its defense exports. The Trump doctrine inverted this. It treated the provision of security not as the foundation of alliance leadership, but as a service to be billed, a favor to be repaid with immediate political loyalty and trade concessions. The guarantee was no longer credible because it was constantly being questioned by the guarantor himself. When the President of the United States suggests he might not honor Article 5 or praises the enemies of the alliance, the entire edifice begins to crack. Europe's creation of SAFE was the structural response to this crack. Canada's inclusion was the human response, a deliberate, value-based choice. The EU, a bloc of 27 democracies, had to choose an external partner to help it build its independent military muscle. It had options: Australia, Five Eyes ally, Japan, or South Korea. technological powerhouses, and frontline states against China. It chose Canada. The leaked rationale from the European Council reveals why. Canada demonstrates strategic patience and transactional integrity. Its political system does not weaponize trade, impose capricious tariffs for domestic political gain, or threaten to abandon treaty commitments following an election. It is a predictable partner. In this single assessment lies the totality of the American strategic failure. The world's most powerful military, its largest economy, was passed over for a country with 1/10 its population because the superpower had become unpredictable. Trust had evaporated. Canada, by virtue of not being the United States under Trump, became the more attractive ally. This sent a chilling message to every other U.S. partner in Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Diversification is not just an option, it is a survival imperative. For Canada, this deal granted something it had lacked since Confederation strategic agency. For decades, any U.S. economic threat, from the softwood lumber disputes to the 2025 tariff threats, forced Ottawa to negotiate from a position of profound weakness. The alternative was economic catastrophe. Now, when a U.S. administration threatens a 35% tariff, Canadian officials can point to the $244 billion SAFE Fund and a burgeoning industrial partnership with the world's second-largest economic bloc. They can, albeit carefully, indicate that there are other markets, other sources of technology, and other security partners. The relationship, once one of overwhelming dominance and dependency, has been subtly but irrevocably rebalanced. The new path is fraught with peril. Canada has not escaped a turbulent relationship with one superpower to enter a calm harbor with a united Europe. It has exchanged a bilateral dependency for a complex multilateral puzzle fraught with its own challenges. First, the Byzantine labyrinth of Europe. The European Union is not a single state, but a contentious federation of 27 sovereign nations, each with its own defense priorities, threat perceptions, and political pressures. The Franco-German engine often drives projects that benefit their national champions, Airbus, Thales, Leonardo, KNDS, creating resentment in Eastern Europe, which wants faster delivery of simpler, battle-proven kit. A project championed by Poland and supported by Canada today could be vetoed or stalled tomorrow by budgetary objections from the Frugal Four, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, or by a new government in Italy deciding to shift priorities. Canada's CDIPA will need to become a master of 27 different political landscapes, procurement laws, and bureaucratic cultures, a task infinitely more complex than dealing with the single, if difficult, U.S. Department of Defense. Second, the sword of Damocles, American retaliation. This is the most immediate and severe risk. Donald Trump's defining foreign policy trait is a propensity for disproportionate retaliation against perceived slights. If his administration concludes that Canada's SAFE membership is not just a business decision, but an act of strategic betrayal, a deliberate move to undermine American industry and ally with a bloc seeking autonomy from U.S. leadership, the response could be economically devastating. The threats of 35% across-the-board tariffs could become reality overnight. Secondary sanctions could be applied, targeting Canadian financial institutions that facilitate euro-denominated defense trade. The U.S. could leverage its control over key technologies, software licenses, or components still embedded in Canadian defense systems to cripple their production. The Carney government calculated this risk. Their presumed deterrence is twofold. First, the asymmetric interdependence of the North American economy. Millions of U.S. jobs depend on seamless cross-border trade. Integrated supply chains, especially in automotive and energy, would be obliterated by a full trade war, harming key Trump voting states. Second, the political optics. Openly destroying the economy of a peaceful Democratic ally for pursuing a more independent defense policy would be a propaganda gift to China and Russia and could finally trigger a bipartisan backlash in a weary U.S. Congress. It is a high-stakes game of chicken, and Canada is betting that Trump's transactionalism will recognize the mutual cost as too high. Finally, capacity and competition. There is the question of whether Canadian industry can deliver. Winning a right to bid is not the same as winning contracts. Canadian firms must now compete directly with European industrial giants like Airbus, BAE Systems, Rheinmetall, and Leonardo. These companies have home field advantage, decades of relationships, and are themselves the beneficiaries of SAFE's largesse. Canada's success will depend on offering cutting-edge, cost-competitive technology in its niche areas of excellence, not on trying to be a junior version of the U.S. defense sector it is leaving behind. The ratification of Canada's SAFE membership will be finalized in the coming weeks. By early 2026, the first Canadian bids will be on European desks. The continent is on a 5 year sprint to 2030 with total defense investment, combining SAFE, national budgets, and other initiatives, projected to exceed $1 trillion. A new military industrial complex is being born, and at its heart is a transatlantic partnership that deliberately excludes the United States. This outcome is not the result of European anti Americanism or Canadian treachery. It is the direct, foreseeable consequence of a foreign policy that mistook bullying for negotiation and domination for partnership. The United States spent decades building a system of alliances based on the premise that American leadership was benevolent, predictable, and ultimately in everyone's interest. The Trump presidency systematically dismantled that premise, teaching allies that dependence on Washington was their greatest vulnerability. Canada's journey into the safe fortress is the first major proof of that lesson being learned. It marks the end of uncontested American hegemony in the West and the beginning of a more fragmented multipolar alliance system where trust and reliability are prized above raw power. The cost to the United States is not merely $244 billion in lost contracts. It is the corrosion of its foundational power, the power to attract, to lead, and to inspire confidence. When your closest neighbor and ally decides it is safer to build a moat with your friends than to rely on your protection, you have not just lost a deal. You have lost the plot. The world is watching, and the map of power is being redrawn, not in Washington, but in Brussels, with a quiet signature from Ottawa.